It was a chilly morning in Chicago, and the courtroom buzzed with its usual mix of tension and boredom. Lawyers shuffled papers, witnesses fidgeted nervously, and the bailiff called out names in a monotone voice. Among the crowd stood Denzel, a tall man wearing a slightly worn-out suit that looked like it had seen better days. He wasn't your typical defendant. His hands were calloused from years of hard work as a janitor at the very courthouse where he now stood. But beneath his rough exterior lay a mind sharper than most people realized. Denzel had spent countless nights after his shifts devouring old law books he found discarded in the trash bins behind the courthouse. To him, those dusty pages weren't just words. They were tools, weapons even, to fight against the injustices he saw every day growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce. Today, he was here for something small, a traffic ticket. But to him, this was more than just a court appearance. It was a chance to prove himself. As Denzel waited for his turn, Judge Harold Whitmore entered the room. Everyone stood up briefly before sitting back down. If there was one thing everyone knew about Judge Whitmore, it was that he didn't tolerate nonsense. Known for his sharp tongue and strict demeanor, he often left defendants feeling smaller than when they walked in. Some said he ran his courtroom like a dictator. Others whispered that his harshness came from years of dealing with difficult cases. Either way, no one wanted to be on the receiving end of his wrath. When it was finally Denzel's turn, the judge barely glanced at him. Instead, he focused on the file in front of him, flipping through papers with an air of disinterest. Then, without looking up, Judge Whitmore asked, "Are you represented by counsel?" Denzel cleared his throat and replied firmly, "No, Your Honor. I'll represent myself." The judge raised an eyebrow, glancing up for the first time. His eyes narrowed as he took in Denzel's appearance. The faded suit, the tired face, the quiet confidence that seemed oddly misplaced. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. And then, in a tone dripping with disdain, Judge Whitmore said, "Why don't you just go back to Africa? You clearly don't belong here." The courtroom froze. People exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Even the bailiff shifted awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. The comment was jarring, offensive, and completely out of line. Yet instead of reacting angrily, Denzel remained calm. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and responded quietly but firmly, "Your Honor, I'm not going anywhere. Let's proceed with the case." His response caught the judge off guard. Most defendants would have either exploded in anger or crumbled under such blatant disrespect, but Denzel did neither. There was something about the way he carried himself, his steady gaze, his composed voice, that suggested he wasn't someone to be underestimated. Still, Judge Whitmore wasn't convinced. He leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly as if amused by what he assumed would be a futile effort. "All right," the judge said dismissively, waving a hand. "Let's see what you've got." What happened next changed everything. Not just for Denzel, but for everyone in that courtroom. Little did Judge Whitmore know he was about to meet someone who understood the law far better than he gave him credit for. Someone who had learned its intricacies not in a classroom, but through sheer determination and grit. As Denzel stepped forward to present his case, the atmosphere shifted. The initial mockery turned into curiosity, and soon enough curiosity morphed into disbelief. This was no ordinary defendant. This was a man on a mission, a man who refused to let anyone define his worth based on their prejudices. And as the proceedings unfolded, it became clear that Denzel wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, every dreamer who dared to challenge the status quo, and every voice that had been silenced by power. The stage was set. All eyes were on Denzel. What followed was nothing short of extraordinary, a display of brilliance that left even the harshest critics speechless. But that's a story for another part. For now, the courtroom held its breath, waiting to see how this unlikely hero would turn the tables. The courtroom was tense, almost like the air before a storm. Everyone could feel it. Something big was about to happen. Denzel stood there, calm and collected, as if he hadn't just been insulted by the judge. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and opened his folder. Inside were notes he had written late at night after long shifts cleaning offices. Notes filled with legal terms, case references, and strategies he had pieced together from those old law books. This wasn't just a man defending himself. This was someone stepping into the ring ready to fight, not with fists but with knowledge. Judge Whitmore leaned forward in his chair, his expression a mix of skepticism and irritation. "All right," he said sharply. "Let's hear what you've got to say, but make it quick, I don't have all day." Denzel nodded respectfully, though his eyes showed no fear. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began, his voice steady. Then, without missing a beat, he launched into his argument. What came next stunned everyone in the room. He started by pointing out flaws in the prosecution's case. The traffic ticket? It was issued based on shaky evidence. The officer claimed Denzel had run a red light, but Denzel had proof, a grainy photo taken by a nearby security camera, that showed the light was yellow when he crossed the intersection. Denzel didn't just present the photo, he explained how traffic laws define the difference between running a red light and entering an intersection during a yellow signal. He cited specific sections of the vehicle code, quoting them word for word. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't supposed to happen. Defendants representing themselves usually stumbled over basic questions or got emotional. But Denzel? He sounded like a seasoned lawyer, breaking down complex ideas into simple points that even someone unfamiliar with the law could understand. Judge Whitmore tried to interrupt him, cutting in with sarcastic remarks. "You memorized all this from some book?" he sneered, clearly trying to undermine Denzel's credibility. Denzel didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he smiled faintly and replied, "I didn't just memorize it, Your Honor. I studied it, I understood it, and more importantly, I applied it." His composure threw the judge off balance. Whitmore frowned, tapping his gavel against the desk absent-mindedly. Meanwhile, Denzel continued, methodically dismantling every piece of the prosecution's argument. He pointed out inconsistencies in the police report, questioned why the officer hadn't followed proper protocol, and highlighted technical errors that weakened their case. At one point, he turned to the gallery and addressed the audience briefly, not arrogantly, but in a way that made people sit up straighter. "Laws exist to protect us," he said, "but they can also be misused if we're not careful. Today I'm standing here not because I broke the law, but because someone decided to bend it. That's not justice. Justice means fairness. Justice means truth." The words resonated. People nodded quietly, some whispering to each other. The court clerk paused mid-note-taking, glancing up with curiosity. No one expected this kind of eloquence from a janitor-turned-defendant. But Denzel wasn't done yet. After presenting his evidence, he requested permission to cross-examine the arresting officer. Judge Whitmore hesitated, clearly reluctant to give him more time to shine. Still, rules were rules, and Denzel had every right to question the witness. With a heavy sigh, the judge waved him forward. As the officer took the stand, Denzel approached confidently. He didn't yell or act aggressively. Instead, he spoke softly, almost conversationally, lulling the officer into a false sense of security. At first, the question seemed harmless. "Can you describe the lighting conditions at the intersection? Did you use radar or visual estimation to determine my speed?" But as the line of questioning went on, cracks began to show in the officer's testimony. Denzel asked about the timing of the traffic signals. The officer hesitated, unsure of the exact details. Then Denzel brought up dashcam footage, or rather, the lack of it. "Isn't it standard procedure to record stops like this?" he asked innocently. The officer stammered, admitting that the camera had malfunctioned that day. Denzel pressed further, exposing contradictions in the officer's story. By the end of the cross-examination, it was clear that the prosecution's case was falling apart. Throughout all of this, Judge Whitmore watched silently, his earlier smugness replaced by unease. He couldn't deny the skill with which Denzel handled himself. Every objection raised by the prosecutor was met with a well-reasoned counter-argument. Every attempt to discredit Denzel only made him look more credible. The courtroom, once filled with whispers of doubt, now buzzed with admiration. When Denzel finished his closing statement, there was a moment of silence. He didn't raise his voice or gesture dramatically. Instead, he simply looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, I believe the evidence speaks for itself. If the law is applied fairly, then the verdict should be clear." For the first time that day, Judge Whitmore didn't have a snide remark ready. He sat back in his chair, staring at Denzel as if seeing him for the first time. The man standing before him wasn't just a janitor or a defendant. He was someone who had mastered the system despite being excluded from it. Someone who refused to let prejudice define him. And while the verdict hadn't been announced yet, one thing was certain. Denzel had already won the respect of everyone in that room. His brilliance wasn't just about knowing the law. It was about using it to challenge injustice, to stand up for himself, and to remind everyone present that true strength comes from within. The gavel would strike soon enough, sealing the outcome of the case. But regardless of the decision, Denzel had proven something far greater, that talent and determination could break through even the thickest walls of bias and doubt. The courtroom was dead silent as Judge Whitmore stared at Denzel, his gavel hovering mid-air. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The judge's face betrayed a mix of frustration and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. Here was a man, someone he had dismissed so casually at the start of the hearing, standing tall, having dismantled the prosecution's case with precision and poise. It wasn't just skill, it was brilliance wrapped in humility. Finally, Judge Whitmore cleared his throat and spoke. "All right," he said gruffly, trying to regain control of the room. "Let's move forward." But the tone of his voice had shifted slightly. Gone was the sharp arrogance from earlier. Now there was an undertone of uncertainty, maybe even respect. Denzel nodded politely, though inside, he allowed himself a small sense of satisfaction. He knew he had made his point, not just legally but personally. This wasn't about proving himself to the judge or anyone else in that room. It was about showing that intelligence and determination could exist anywhere, regardless of background or circumstances. As the proceedings continued, curiosity began to ripple through the gallery. People whispered quietly to each other, their initial skepticism turning into awe. Some leaned forward, eager not to miss a single word Denzel said. Others exchanged glances, clearly impressed by how confidently he navigated the complexities of the law. A few even pulled out their phones, discreetly recording snippets of the trial. Word was spreading fast. Something extraordinary was happening here. When the judge finally called for a recess, the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Reporters who had been covering unrelated cases lingered near the exit, sensing they might have stumbled onto a story worth telling. One bold journalist approached Denzel as he stepped outside for some fresh air. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, holding up her recorder. "Can I ask you a few questions?" Denzel paused, surprised but calm. He didn't seek attention, but he also knew this was an opportunity to share his journey and perhaps inspire others. "Sure," he replied with a slight smile. "But let's keep it brief." The reporter started with the obvious question. "How did you learn all this? Most people spend years in law school, yet you seem to know the law inside out." Denzel chuckled softly, leaning against the courthouse railing. "It's not as glamorous as it sounds," he admitted. "I work as a janitor here, and over the years I've found old law books in the trash bins. At first I read them out of curiosity, but then I realized they held answers to questions I'd always had. Questions about fairness, about why things are the way they are. So I kept studying. Late nights, early mornings, you name it. It wasn't easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." His words struck a chord with those listening. Passers-by stopped to hear more, drawn in by the sincerity in his voice. Someone asked, "Did you ever think about going to law school?" Denzel shook his head. "I wanted to, believe me. But life doesn't always give you choices. Bills to pay, responsibilities to take care of. It adds up. Still, I figured if I couldn't go to law school, I could bring law school to me. Those books became my teachers." By now, a small crowd had gathered around him. Among them was an elderly woman who had been sitting in the gallery. She stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice trembling. "You remind me of my grandson. He's smart, but he thinks he can't do anything because of where we come from. Seeing you today gives me hope, for him, for all of us." Denzel nodded, touched by her words. "Hope is powerful," he said gently, "and it's contagious. If my story helps even one person believe in themselves, then everything I've gone through will be worth it." Back inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore watched the scene unfold from a distance. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the conversation caught his attention. As much as he hated to admit it, Denzel's presence was humbling. The man had every reason to lash out after being insulted, yet he chose grace instead. He didn't let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his energy into something constructive. That kind of resilience was rare. When the session resumed, the atmosphere felt different. The tension had softened, replaced by a quiet anticipation. Even the prosecutor seemed less combative, aware that the odds were no longer in his favor. Denzel presented his final arguments with the same clarity and conviction that had marked his performance throughout the day. By the time he finished, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. The verdict would go in his favor. Judge Whitmore took a long pause before delivering his decision. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured, almost reflective. "Based on the evidence presented and the arguments made, I find in favor of the defendant. Case dismissed." A wave of applause broke out in the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern glare. But the sentiment remained. Strangers patted Denzel on the back, congratulating him on his victory. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, already envisioning headlines. Yet amidst the chaos, Denzel stayed grounded. He thanked the judge respectfully, ignoring the earlier insult, and left the courthouse without fanfare. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. Denzel walked slowly, savoring the weightlessness he felt after months of preparation. He knew this was just the beginning. Winning the case was important, but it wasn't the ultimate goal. His dream was bigger: to use his knowledge to help others, to fight for justice in a system that often favored the privileged. Little did he know his journey was far from over. The ripple effects of that day would spread farther than he imagined, touching lives and sparking conversations about equality, access, and reform. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing he had taken a significant step toward changing not just his own life but the world around him. The dismissal of the case was a monumental victory, but for Denzel it was only the beginning. As he stepped out of the courthouse that evening, the air felt different, lighter, charged with possibility. News of his courtroom triumph had spread like wildfire. Reporters camped outside the building, eager to capture sound bites from the man who had turned a minor traffic ticket into a lesson on justice and perseverance. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and questions came, rapid fire. How does it feel to win against such odds? What's next for you? Do you plan to become a lawyer? Denzel handled the attention with humility, deflecting praise and focusing instead on the bigger picture. "This wasn't about me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It was about proving that anyone can stand up for themselves if they're willing to put in the work. I'm just one person, but there are millions out there fighting their own battles every day." His words resonated deeply. People saw themselves in him, a reflection of their struggles, hopes, and dreams. Social media exploded with posts celebrating his achievement. Hashtags like Dar's self-made lawyer and justice for all trended online. Videos of his cross-examination went viral, racking up millions of views. Comment sections filled with stories of people inspired by his courage. One user wrote, "If he can do it, maybe I can too." Another added, "This gives me faith in the system again." But fame wasn't what Denzel wanted. What he truly craved was change, a shift in how society viewed potential and opportunity. And so, when prominent attorneys reached out offering mentorship, he accepted graciously, seeing it as a chance to grow while staying true to his roots. These mentors weren't just impressed by his legal knowledge, they admired his integrity and passion. They recognized that Denzel wasn't just trying to climb the ladder of success, he was trying to widen it so others could join him. Becoming a licensed attorney, however, wouldn't be easy. The Bar Association scrutinized his application closely, raising objections due to his lack of formal education. Some members argued that law school was non-negotiable, insisting that practical experience alone couldn't replace academic training. Denzel understood their concerns but refused to back down. He submitted essays detailing his journey, highlighting cases he had studied, and even included letters of recommendation from lawyers who had witnessed his skills firsthand. During his interview with the bar committee, Denzel faced tough questions designed to test not just his legal expertise but also his character. When asked why he thought he deserved a license despite skipping traditional schooling, he responded without hesitation. Because justice shouldn't depend on where you come from or what resources you have access to. It should depend on your ability to understand the law and use it to serve others. I may not have gone to law school, but I've lived the law every day, in every challenge I've faced. His answer left the panel silent, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and inequality within the legal profession. After months of deliberation, they granted him permission to take the bar exam. A decision met with both applause and criticism. Critics accused the committee of lowering standards, while supporters hailed it as a step toward inclusivity. Preparing for the bar exam was grueling. Denzel juggled long hours at his janitorial job with late-night study sessions. He relied heavily on donated textbooks and free online courses, often sacrificing sleep to ensure he covered everything. Friends and colleagues pitched in however they could, bringing him meals or helping him practice mock exams. Despite the challenges, Denzel remained focused, driven by the belief that his success could pave the way for others like him. On the day of the exam, nerves buzzed through the testing center. Denzel sat among candidates much younger than him, many fresh out of prestigious universities. While some looked intimidated by his presence, others offered encouraging smiles. The test itself was brutal, a marathon of complex questions designed to weed out all but the most dedicated. But Denzel approached it with the same determination that had carried him this far. When the results came in, they confirmed what many already suspected. Denzel had passed. Not only that, but he scored higher than most candidates, earning distinctions in several sections. The news sent shockwaves through the legal community. Law schools invited him to speak at conferences, civil rights organizations sought his advice, and local news stations dubbed him the janitor-turned-lawyer who beat the system. Yet, despite the accolades, Denzel stayed grounded. He chose to specialize in civil rights law, dedicating his career to representing marginalized communities. His clients ranged from low-income families fighting eviction to individuals challenging discriminatory practices in the workplace. Each case reminded him of his own struggles, fueling his resolve to make a difference. One particularly memorable case involved a young man wrongfully arrested during a protest. The charges were vague, relying more on prejudice than evidence. Denzel took the case pro bono, knowing the stakes extended beyond one individual. In court, he delivered a stirring argument about the importance of protecting free speech and holding authorities accountable. Once again, his performance captivated those in attendance, including Judge Whitmore, who happened to preside over the trial. After the verdict, in favor of Denzel's client, the judge approached him privately. "You've come a long way since our first meeting," Whitmore admitted, his tone sincere. "I underestimated you then, and for that I apologize. You're exactly the kind of advocate this field needs." Denzel accepted the apology graciously, acknowledging the progress Whitmore had made in confronting his biases. Their relationship evolved from adversaries to mutual respect, symbolizing the transformative power of growth and understanding. Denzel's reputation grew. So did his influence. He founded a nonprofit organization aimed at providing legal education and resources to underserved communities. Workshops were held in community centers, libraries, and even churches, teaching people about their rights and how to navigate the legal system. Volunteers poured in, inspired by his mission, Together, they created a network of support, empowering individuals to advocate for themselves. Through it all, Denzel never forgot where he came from. He still worked part-time as a janitor, using his earnings to fund scholarships for aspiring lawyers who lacked financial means. To him, success wasn't measured by wealth or titles, it was measured by impact. Every life he touched, every barrier he broke, brought him closer to fulfilling his dream of creating a fairer, more inclusive world. And though challenges lay ahead, Denzel faced them with unwavering optimism. He knew the road wouldn't always be smooth, but he also knew that every step forward mattered. Because in the end, it wasn't just about winning cases or earning recognition. It was about leaving behind a legacy of hope, resilience, and justice for generations to come. Years rolled by, and Denzel's tireless efforts began to reshape the world around him. The legal clinic he started in his old neighborhood had grown into a network of centers across multiple cities, each one serving as a lifeline for people struggling against injustice. What began as a small operation above a corner store now stood as a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most marginalized voices could find strength when given the right tools. But Denzel knew that systemic change required more than grassroots movements. It needed leadership from within the very institutions he had once challenged. One day, an unexpected letter arrived at his office. It was an official invitation, not just any invitation, but one asking him to consider taking on a judicial role. The state's governor, impressed by Denzel's work and reputation, wanted him to serve as a judge in a newly established court focused on civil rights and police accountability. At first, Denzel hesitated. He had always seen himself as an advocate, someone who fought alongside the oppressed rather than presiding over them. Could he really step into a position of authority? Would people trust him to remain fair and impartial? After much thought and plenty of conversations with mentors, friends, and former clients, he accepted the offer. Not because he craved power or prestige, but because he believed this was another chance to make a difference. If he could influence decisions from the bench, perhaps he could ensure that justice wasn't just served, it was truly felt. On his first day as a judge, Denzel walked into the same courthouse where he had once been humiliated. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. As he entered the courtroom, everyone stood, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Even Judge Whitmore, now retired and sitting quietly in the gallery, rose to his feet. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Denzel gave him a subtle nod. It wasn't about gloating or proving a point. It was about acknowledging how far they had both come. As Denzel took his seat behind the bench, he looked out at the room filled with lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and spectators. Many faces were familiar, people he had helped, inspired, or simply crossed paths with during his journey. Others were strangers, yet they carried the same hopes and fears he had once known all too well. Taking a deep breath, he addressed the court in a voice steady and warm. "Justice," he began, "isn't just about applying laws. It's about understanding lives. My job here isn't to pass judgment based on technicalities or biases. It's to listen, to empathize, and to ensure that every person leaves this room feeling heard. That's what I'll strive for every single day." His words set the tone for his tenure. From the start, Denzel made it clear that his courtroom would operate differently. Gone were the days of rigid formality and dismissive attitudes. Instead, he encouraged open dialogue, allowing defendants to explain their circumstances and judges to ask clarifying questions. He pushed for restorative justice programs, focusing on rehabilitation rather than punishment whenever possible, and he demanded transparency, ensuring that every decision was backed by evidence and explained thoroughly. One case stood out among many: a young woman accused of shoplifting groceries to feed her children. Her story tugged at the heartstrings of everyone in the room. Prosecutors argued that leniency would set a dangerous precedent, while defense attorneys pleaded for compassion. When it came time for sentencing, Denzel leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I understand the seriousness of theft," he said, "but I also see the desperation behind it. Rather than sending you to jail, which would only deepen the cycle of poverty, let's explore alternatives: community service, parenting classes, access to food assistance programs, These are solutions that address the root cause of your actions. The verdict sparked debate outside the courtroom, with critics accusing him of being too soft. But supporters praised his approach, pointing out that punitive measures often failed to prevent repeat offenses. Over time, statistics proved Denzel right. Recidivism rates dropped significantly in cases handled through restorative practices. His methods became a model for other courts, earning him recognition not just locally but nationally. Beyond his courtroom duties, Denzel continued to champion broader reforms. He partnered with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at reducing racial disparities in sentencing, improving access to legal aid, and holding law enforcement accountable for misconduct. His advocacy extended beyond speeches and policy papers. He walked the streets, meeting directly with community members to hear their concerns and ideas. Whether it was attending town hall meetings, visiting schools to inspire students, or joining protests against unjust policies, Denzel remained deeply connected to the people he served. His impact reached far beyond the legal system. Young people, who had grown up hearing his story, began pursuing careers in law, inspired by his example. Some enrolled in universities, determined to follow in his footsteps. Others joined nonprofits or grassroots organizations, eager to create change in their own ways. Denzel often visited these groups, sharing advice and encouragement. "Don't wait for permission to lead," he told them. "Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Progress is built one step at a time." Even as his fame grew, Denzel stayed grounded. He still lived modestly, refusing to let success inflate his ego. Friends joked that he hadn't changed since his janitorial days, still rolling up his sleeves to help clean up after events, still offering rides to neighbors in need, still treating everyone with kindness and humility. To him, titles didn't matter. What mattered was action, the tangible difference he could make in people's lives. Decades later, when Denzel finally retired from the bench, he left behind a legacy that transcended generations. Streets were named after him, scholarships were created in his honor, and documentaries chronicled his journey from underdog to icon. Yet none of those accolades meant as much to him as the quiet moments when someone approached him to say thank you for believing in them, for standing up for them, for showing them that greatness wasn't reserved for the privileged few. In his final public speech before stepping away from the spotlight, Denzel reflected on everything he had learned along the way. "When I started this journey," he said, "I didn't know if I'd succeed. All I knew was that I couldn't stay silent while others suffered. So I chose to act, to fight, to learn, to grow. And what I discovered is this: we're stronger together. Every victory belongs not just to me, but to everyone who supported me, challenged me, and trusted me to keep going." As he stepped down from the podium, applause erupted, echoing through the auditorium like waves crashing against a shore. Tears streamed down faces, young and old, as people celebrated not just a man, but a movement rooted in resilience, fueled by compassion and guided by an unwavering belief in justice. Denzel's story didn't end there. Though he retreated from public life, his influence continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he might never fully realize. Laws changed, systems evolved, and communities thrived, all because one man refused to accept the limits placed upon him. He taught the world that brilliance has no boundaries, that courage can conquer fear, and that hope has the power to transform even the darkest corners of society. And so the janitor-turned-judge became more than a legend. He became a reminder, a living testament, that no matter where you start, you have the ability to rise, to rewrite your story, to build bridges instead of walls, to dream bigger than anyone thinks possible. Because in the end, it's not about where you come from. It's about where you choose to go. And Denzel chose to take us all toward a brighter, fairer future. Denzel's journey was far from over. In fact, it felt like the real work had just begun. Winning cases and earning recognition wasn't enough for him. He wanted to change the system itself. He believed that justice shouldn't be a privilege, reserved for those with money or connections. It should belong to everyone, no matter their background. And so he rolled up his sleeves and got to work, determined to make a lasting impact. One of the first things Denzel did after passing the bar exam was open a small legal clinic in the heart of his old neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, just a modest office above a corner store, but it quickly became a beacon of hope for people who had nowhere else to turn. Every day, lines stretched out the door as residents came seeking advice on everything from landlord disputes to immigration issues. Denzel didn't charge much, if anything at all. Instead, he asked clients to pay what they could, whether it was cash, groceries, or simply volunteering time to help others in need. The clinic wasn't just about solving problems, it was about teaching people how to stand up for themselves. Denzel held workshops every Saturday morning, explaining basic legal concepts in plain language. He taught them how to read contracts, file complaints, and recognize when their rights were being violated. Knowledge is power, he often said. If you understand the rules, you can play the game and maybe even rewrite it. Word spread fast about the clinic, and soon volunteers joined the cause. Some were retired lawyers looking to give back, while others were college students eager to learn from someone who had defied the odds. Together, they formed a team dedicated to fighting injustice, one case at a time. The atmosphere buzzed with energy, laughter, and occasional tears as stories of hardship turned into victories big and small. But Denzel didn't stop there. He knew that systemic change required more than individual efforts. It needed policy reform. So he started attending city council meetings, speaking out against discriminatory practices and advocating for laws that protected vulnerable communities. At first, some officials dismissed him as an idealist with no real influence. But Denzel didn't let that discourage him. He showed up week after week, armed with data, personal anecdotes, and an unshakable belief in fairness. Slowly but surely, people began to listen. One pivotal moment came during a heated debate over affordable housing. Developers wanted to demolish several low-income apartment complexes to build luxury condos, claiming it would boost the local economy. Residents begged city leaders to intervene, arguing that they'd be displaced without options. When it was Denzel's turn to speak, he stepped up to the podium, clutching folders filled with research and letters from affected families. "This isn't just about buildings," he said, his voice steady but passionate. "It's about people. Real people who wake up every morning, send their kids to school, and go to work hoping for a better future. If we take away their homes, we're taking away their dignity. Is that really the kind of community we want to create?" His words struck a chord. The room erupted in applause, and even some skeptics nodded in agreement. Thanks to his advocacy, the proposal was rejected, and funding was allocated to renovate the existing apartments instead. For the residents, it was more than a win. It was proof that their voices mattered. As Denzel continued to push for change, his reputation grew beyond the confines of his neighborhood. Civil rights organizations invited him to join panels and campaigns aimed at addressing racial profiling, police misconduct, and unequal access to education. His insights were invaluable because they came not just from books or theories, but from lived experience. He spoke truthfully, holding nothing back, and challenged policymakers to confront uncomfortable realities. One such event took place at a national conference where hundreds of activists, lawyers, and politicians gathered to discuss criminal justice reform. Denzel was asked to deliver the keynote address, a daunting task for anyone, let alone someone who had spent most of his life cleaning floors rather than standing on stages. But as he walked up to the microphone, he felt strangely calm. Looking out at the sea of faces, he remembered why he was there. Not for himself, but for everyone counting on him to keep fighting. "I never thought I'd be here today," he began, pausing to let his words sink in. "Growing up, I was told I wouldn't amount to much, that my dreams were too big, my goals too ambitious. But I refused to believe that. Because deep down, I knew something many people forget. Potential isn't limited by circumstance. It's nurtured by opportunity." He went on to share his story, weaving together moments of struggle and triumph. He talked about the nights he spent reading law books by candlelight, the countless rejections he faced, and the times he doubted himself. but kept going anyway. By the end of his speech, the audience was on its feet, cheering loudly. Strangers approached him afterward, thanking him for reminding them of their own strength. Despite the accolades, Denzel remained humble. He knew that true success wasn't measured by applause or awards, it was measured by the lives he touched. One evening, as he locked up the clinic, a young boy stopped him on the sidewalk. Clutching a worn notebook, he shyly asked, "Do you think I could be a lawyer someday?" "Like you?" Denzel knelt down to meet the boy's gaze. "Of course you can," he replied with a warm smile. "All it takes is hard work and believing in yourself. And remember, if anyone tells you that, you can't prove them wrong." Moments like these reminded Denzel why he kept pushing forward. Each child inspired, each family helped, each injustice fought. It all added up to something greater than himself. He envisioned a world where talent and determination weren't overshadowed by prejudice, where opportunities were distributed equally, and where justice truly served everyone. Years passed and Denzel's influence only grew stronger. His nonprofit expanded to multiple cities, offering legal aid and education to thousands. Lawmakers consulted him on new policies, knowing his perspective was rooted in reality rather than rhetoric. Schools invited him to inspire students, showing them that heroes weren't born. They were made through grit and perseverance. Through it all, Denzel stayed connected to his roots. He still visited the courthouse where his journey began, sometimes sitting in the gallery to observe trials. Occasionally, he ran into Judge Whitmore, now retired, and volunteering as a mediator. Their conversations had evolved from awkward apologies to genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. "You've changed a lot of lives," Whitmore once remarked during one of their chats, "including mine." Denzel chuckled softly. "We've all got room to grow," he said. "That's what makes life interesting." And indeed, life was interesting, for Denzel, and for everyone fortunate enough to cross paths with him. From janitor to advocate, from underdog to role model, he had proven that greatness wasn't defined by titles or wealth. It was defined by the courage to challenge the status quo, the compassion to lift others up, and the unwavering belief that a better world was possible. The fight was far from over, but Denzel faced it with optimism. Every step forward, no matter how small, brought him closer to his vision of equality and justice. And as long as there were people willing to listen, learn, and act, he knew the future held endless possibilities.